Before you watch this tutorial, please watch the tutorial on the basic rules of composition. Once you've watched it, then we can start thinking about how those basic rules apply to multi-figure composition. So, what were the basic rules? Let's just quickly review the first one. The first one is to balance positive negative space. Which means what? If I have some kind of still life, I want to make sure that my vase, my little flower, isn't too small to fit the rest of the environment. So if you guys remember, negative space is the space around the object, positive space is the object itself. What would be a more successful version of this composition? Well, one where the vase occupies a little bit more of our frame. How does this apply to multi-figure composition? Well, if we have some kind of landscape, mountains, clouds, a pond, maybe some kind of outcrop of trees, you don't want to make your figures too small. One figure here, because in this case, this is no longer a multi-figure composition. This is now a landscape with a few figures basically being utilized as an accent. You want to make sure that your figures are dominant, that they are the main part of the subject matter in your composition. So as opposed to a landscape with a few little ant-like figures in it, you want to make sure that your figures are balanced within the environment. So something like this, the second figure is here, like this. I'm being kind of abstract here. So that they are the dominant element in the composition. Now, as I was mentioning in the first part of this tutorial, there's absolutely no reason why you cannot crop off the figure. So if you have a standing figure, you can choose to maybe do a torso like this, and then the second figure you can show in its entirety. This is perfectly legitimate. And then your last figure could be way in the distance, so long as you have a couple of figures that are doing a good job filling up the space. So balance positive negative space. Negative space. Number two. I don't know if I have these entirely in order, but the second is to avoid a number of different things. All of them are called centering. Avoid centering. So in terms of still life, what does that mean? Well, exactly what I did here. Don't put the vase exactly in the middle of the composition. There's a few other kinds of centering when you have multiple objects in a picture. This is another form of centering, which is called balancing. When you have objects of equal visual weight, in this case crooked vases, on equal sides of the composition. There's another kind of balancing, which is actually what I did here, which is called aligning. So that is taking a few objects and aligning them all along the same horizontal format. So these are all forms of centering. This is centering proper. This is called balancing. This is called aligning. How does this work when it comes to the figure? Well, do not clump all of your figures all in one spot. That would just be silly and confusing, right? All kinds of really complicated overlaps, right? Everything's kind of clumped together, right? Do not balance. Don't do that. Which means have one figure over here, like this, and then have another figure that is also over here. And by the way, this is also guilty of aligning, right? Why is this really, really important? Well, balanced compositions do not move the eye effectively. They tend to draw the eye towards a single spot, whereas what you really want out of a composition is for the eye to move from one element of the composition to the next, the next, the next, the next, through the space. Balancing splits the composition in two parts. So composition needs to do two things. It needs to move the eye, and it needs to unify. It needs to find ways to make everything in the composition feel part of a whole. When you balance the composition, it splits the composition into two parts. Aligning kind of does the same thing as centering in that it prevents the eye from moving throughout the space. The eye gets kind of stuck moving back and forth this way. So the corollary of this is to distribute and off balance your objects. What do I mean? Well, it's always a good idea to have an object that is a little more towards the foreground, and then an object that's a little bit further back, and then an object that's even further back. So right now I'm distributing my objects through the space. That gives me more off balance and moves the eye effectively through my environment. Distribute your objects in space. Normally in a traditional composition, artists are very careful to make distinctions between some kind of foreground element, some kind of middle ground element, and some kind of background element. You don't have to do that. You can clump all your figures in the foreground, but you still want to off balance, meaning that if you have something in the foreground, make that item, in this case the figure, large, and then the two figures in the background, obviously they're in the background, make them a little bit smaller. Off-balance compositions, compositions where you distribute your objects, are always a little more effective than your compositions which are centered, balanced, or aligned. The third one, avoiding tangents. Avoiding tangents. In terms of still life, a tangent is an awkward alignment of objects at different depths. So if we have an apple here, you don't want to place the second apple that's a little further back in such a way that the contours are aligned here, and also you notice that the contours are aligned towards the back of the table. Again, make sure you watch the first the tutorial on the basics of composition. It goes over all this stuff in probably more detail than you'd want. Now, this is really difficult to do when you're dealing with simple objects. So imagine the complication when you have three different figures plus some kind of complicated background. Tangents can occur a lot. So if you guys remember, when I was doing the compositional study, one of the things I was avoiding was having a standing figure. We had the figure of the woman. Let's see if I can draw her. Kind of doing this. In front of a bunch of trees that are going this way. So in this case, I chose to simplify the background. I removed the trees and put some kind of clearing. Why? Because I was worried that the trees would line up with her head and make her feel kind of squeezed in between our shapes. So the problem with tangents is that they create the illusion that things are at the same depth, whereas actually one thing is closer, the other thing is further away. They create a lot of visual confusion. So you always want to be really, really careful about your overlaps. So in the case of, let's say we have two figures here, like this. I want to make sure that the overlap between this figure and the figure standing behind him is really, really clear. So if I have a figure that's standing here, I want to make sure that the way the leg comes out from the back makes it clear that this figure is behind this one and not growing from his head or doing some kind of weirdness. You want to make sure that your overlap is really, really clear, so that there's no visual confusion. Avoid tangents. Easier said than done because, once again, if you've got a bunch of figures overlapping each other, standing in some kind of really complex environment, tangents can occur quite a lot. All right, what else can I tell you? Well, there's lots of other rules. We're talking about introducing diagonals to lead the eye through the space. We'll talk more about that later. Let's talk about cutting off the figure. So I said that absolutely nothing wrong with cutting off, but you do have to be careful where you cut off, because the figure is not an apple, it's not a vase, right? In the case of a vase, you can cut off absolutely anywhere you want. So if I want the vase to cut off here, not a problem. If I want the vase to cut off here, obviously not an issue. When you're dealing with a figure, there are some psychological aspects that you have to consider. Basically, psychologically, there's some places where it's comfortable to cut off a figure, and places where it isn't. So as an example, let's say I have a figure that is kind of just standing here like this. This cutoff is perfectly okay because the cutoff is mid-joint, mid-shin. If I cut off the figure like this, I will have created the sense that there's some kind of amputation here, that the figure is cut off at the knees. So, mid-thigh, perfectly okay, not bad. Mid-hip, perfectly okay. Mid-groin, not okay. Again, turns into amputation. Mid-waist, okay. Mid-torso, perfectly fine. There's a lot of compositions, portraits that are cut off mid-torso. Mid-neck, not okay. That's a decapitation, right? Never cut off through the face. Never cut off through the head. That's also a big problem. So, once again, anytime you're running the cutoff mid-joint, perfectly okay. However, at joints, at elbows, at wrists, that's a problem. So if you have a figure, let's say he's looking this way and he's leaning forward, and here's the wrist, it just looks like I lopped off his wrist, right? Lopped off his hand. So this is okay, though generally not done, right? Mid forearm or mid upper arm, that's okay too. Never cut off mid-foot or mid-ankle. So always be careful about your cutoffs when you're cutting off the figure. It's not a vase, it's a person. And when you do cut off, it creates all kinds of implications psychologically. So for instance, a cutoff like this is going to be really, really super awkward looking, right? Like a Frankenstein monster. So watch out for your cutoff points.